Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're setting sail on the wine-dark Aegean, not for a pleasure cruise, but to trudge through the sand-blasted, salt-caked existence of an ancient Greek merchant. We're here to uncover exactly why risking your life in fortune shipping precious wares from Athens to Alexandria was, to put it mildly, an absolutely dreadful way to make a drachma. You've seen them depicted on ancient vases, or maybe read about them in heroic tales. The bold Greek merchant, master of the Aegean, confidently steering his ship laden with exotic treasures, his gaze fixed on profitable horizons. But let me assure you, being a real Greek merchant plying the route from Athens to Alexandria was nothing like some sun-drenched pottery painting. It was a stomach-churning, mind-fraying, financially ruinous gamble, and for most who plied these treacherous waters, it profoundly, unequivocally sucked. If you're new here, and that sounds like your particular brand of historical investigation, or if you just enjoy a deep dive into the delightful discomforts of the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. And hey, let me know in the comments if you've ever been on a boat trip that felt historically awful, though hopefully without the pirates. Now find a comfortable spot, perhaps on solid ground, a true luxury our merchant rarely enjoyed without a hefty dose of anxiety. Close your eyes for a moment, if you will, and prepare to be tossed on a wine-dark sea of woe with us as we explore the grim realities of the ancient maritime entrepreneur. You weren't so much born into the noble profession of an Athenian sea merchant as you were unceremoniously coughed up by the Aegean itself, already tasting of salt and smelling faintly of impending financial doom. Forget any romantic notions of choosing a life of adventurous commerce. For our young hero Theophilos, the path was as rigidly defined as the grooves worn into the Piraeus docks by centuries of dragged amphorae. His family, a long line of men who confused stubbornness with seamanship, hadn't seen a truly profitable voyage since the golden age of Pericles, or so it felt. No sprawling olive groves or vineyards awaited his inheritance, no comfortable seat in the assembly, no legacy of philosophical treatises. Instead, his birthright consisted of a 40% share in the Sea Slug, a cargo vessel whose name, depressingly, was more of an accurate descriptor than a whimsical moniker. This dubious asset came complete with a collection of hereditary debts, mostly accrued by his grandfather, a man whose primary business strategy seemed to involve wagering heavily on which way the wind wouldn't blow, and an almost supernatural ability to invest in wine just before it turned to vinegar. The family's honor, such as it was inextricably tied to this leaky, creaking, debt-ridden tub, and the ever-present scent of damp wool, decaying fish, and the sharp tang of old, unpayable loans was practically woven into the fabric of Theophilos's swaddling clothes. The sea wasn't a calling. It was a foregone conclusion, the only gaping maw vast enough to potentially swallow the family's mountainous obligations, or failing that, Theophilos himself. His mother probably wept when he was born, and not entirely from joy. From the moment young Theophilos could toddle without immediately pitching face first into the murky harbor waters, a skill he mastered with surprising alacrity after the third near-drowning experience, each rescue accompanied by his father's gruff pronouncement that he was too expensive to lose, but too stupid to keep dry. He was initiated into the family trade. By the tender age of 8, when other Athenian boys of slightly better standing were learning their letters or the rudiments of wrestling, Theophilos was already a seasoned, if undersized and perpetually terrified deckhand. He wasn't so much a child as a small, agile, and remarkably cheap piece of shipboard equipment, useful for scurrying into tight spaces where larger men couldn't fit, usually to discover the source of a new and exciting leak or to retrieve a dropped tool from the Stygian gloom of the bilge. His childhood toys? A fascinating collection of frayed rope ends, perfect for endlessly practicing the 73 essential knots his father insisted he master, until his small fingers were raw and bleeding. He had a particular fondness for a chipped terracotta shard, perhaps from a Carian wine jar, which he imagined was a pirate's lost treasure map, though in reality, It probably just marked the spot where another small fortune had shattered. His playground wasn't the sun-dappled courtyard of a gymnasium, but the chaotic, clamorous, and frankly lethal environment of the Piraeus harbor. It was an olfactory and auditory assault course, the stench of brine, rotting fish, rancid olive oil, animal dung, and unwashed humanity, all mingling with the shouts of stevedores, the screech of wooden cranes groaning under impossible loads, the rhythmic thud of mallets caulking hulls, and the ever-present threat of being crushed by a swinging cargo net or a carelessly rolled barrel. While his peers debated the merits of Homeric heroes, Theophilos was mastering the grim arts of scrubbing barnacles that clung with the tenacity of death itself, distinguishing between 6 different types of ominous cloud formations, each promising a unique flavor of maritime misery, and learning how to haggle with a one-eyed Phoenician scrap dealer for a coil of barely usable rope, as if the fate of nations depended on it, which, given his family's finances, it often did. Fun games included Dodge the Crane Hook, guess what that floating object is, and pray it isn't human, and the ever-popular Find the Rat Before It Eats Tonight's Dinner. His early education was less about philosophy and more about the practical application of leverage, the corrosive properties of seawater on cheap metal, and the profound unwillingness of Poseidon to grant any favors without a hefty and usually bloody price. He learned that the world was hard, the gods were fickle, and the only thing you could truly count on was the eventual failure of poorly maintained equipment. Presiding over this brutal apprenticeship, this floating academy of advanced suffering, was likely Theophilos's own father, Ariston, a man whose face looked like a nautical chart of all the most dangerous waters in the Aegean, weather-beaten, deeply lined, and permanently etched with an expression of weary disappointment, especially when looking at his son. Ariston's pedagogical methods were uncomplicated and remarkably effective, in their own terrifying way. His vocabulary was as sparse and functional as a ship's biscuit, consisting mainly of grunts, inventive curses that could make a hardened dockworker blush, often invoking various sea deities in anatomically improbable situations, and the occasional soul-chilling sigh that somehow conveyed more disapproval than a 40-minute lecture. He taught Theophilos the intricacies of maritime commerce not through patient explanation or encouraging words, but through the sharp sting of a rope's end across his backside for letting a line go slack during a tricky docking maneuver, or the bone-deep weariness that came from being forced to restow the entire cargo of precariously balanced olive oil amphorae for the 5th time in the blazing Mediterranean sun because he hadn't distributed the weight correctly. "The sea doesn't forgive fools, boy," Ariston would rasp, his voice like stones grinding together, "and I can't afford to either." There might have been a twisted, deeply buried sort of affection there, hidden somewhere beneath layers of calloused cynicism and financial anxiety, but it mostly manifested as a relentless, brutal pragmatism. Ariston's primary goal was to hammer enough competence and fear into young Theophilos to ensure he didn't inadvertently sink their only major asset or get himself killed in a stupidly preventable way. Every lesson was a matter of survival. Learning to read the subtle shifts in wind direction wasn't an academic exercise. It was the difference between reaching port and being blown onto the rocks of some god's forsaken island. Understanding the complex art of loading cargo wasn't about neatness. It was about preventing the ship from capsizing in the first squall. Even the constant, back-breaking labor of pumping the bilge, a task usually assigned to the youngest and most expendable, was framed as a vital lesson in diligence. If this bilge fills, we all drown. Pump like your life depends on it, because it does. And so, Theophilos learned his trade in a crucible of fear, exhaustion, and the occasional cuff to the head, slowly but surely transforming from a terrified child into a youth who was merely chronically apprehensive and exceptionally good at tying knots with his eyes closed. The faint romantic allure the sea might hold for a landlubber was systematically scoured from him, replaced by a grim understanding of its power, its treachery, and its profound indifference to human suffering. Holidays? Sacred festival days off? Paid leave for mental anguish? These were concepts so utterly alien to Theophilos and his long-suffering crew that they might as well have been messages from a distant, more civilized star. The Aegean Sea didn't observe the Athenian civic calendar, and the creditors back in Piraeus certainly didn't grant extensions based on religious observance or debilitating seasickness. The only true day off was the one where you found yourself unexpectedly and permanently at the bottom of the ocean, and even then, Hades probably had chores lined up. A typical day for Theophilos, when the sea slug was lumbering its way between ports, was a masterclass in sustained discomfort and low-grade anxiety, beginning long before Helios even considered hitching his horses to the solar chariot. The pre-dawn chill, thick with the dampness that seemed to emanate from the ship's very timbers, would seep into his bones as he roused himself from a fitful sleep on a coil of rope or a particularly unyielding patch of deck. There was no gentle awakening. Usually it was the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, the urgent call of nature over the side, or the high-pitched squeal of a rat mistaking his ear for a forgotten olive. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a sacrament of misery. A hunk of maza, that ubiquitous barley cake, now several weeks into the voyage and possessing the texture of a petrified sponge and the subtle flavor of despair, would be gnawed upon, washed down with a swig of heavily watered wine that tasted faintly of the goatskin it was stored in and the lingering regret of last night's nightmares. Sometimes, if the rats hadn't been too ambitious, there might be a few leathery olives or a clove of garlic to add a frisson of excitement to the palate, and to ensure your breath could ward off anything short of a kraken. Then, the real fun began. First light meant a thorough, if futile, inspection of the sea slug itself. Theophilos would run a practiced, weary eye over the rigging, the network of ropes that held the single, patched square sail aloft, looking for new frays, suspicious creaks, or any sign that a critical component was about to spectacularly give up the ghost. He'd check the lashings on the cargo, a motley collection of amphorae filled with wine, olive oil, or perhaps grain, praying to Hermes that they hadn't shifted too much during the night's pitching and rolling, threatening to unbalance the ship or smash into 1,000 costly shards. The steering oars, massive planks that required constant wrestling to keep the ship vaguely on course, would be examined for stress fractures. And always, there was the ritual sounding of the bilge. This involved dropping a weighted line into the ship's slimy, stinking guts to see how much of the Aegean had decided to invite itself aboard during the night. The answer was invariably too much, prompting the organization of the bilge pumping party, a joyous, back-breaking exercise involving crude wooden pumps, or more often, an endless chain of leaky leather buckets, all accompanied by a chorus of curses and the rich aroma of stagnant seawater, rotting food scraps, and general shipboard filth. This was often a multi-hour affair, leaving everyone soaked, stinking, and thoroughly disabused of any notion that life at sea was glamorous. If the winds were favorable, a rare and suspicious occurrence that usually presaged some other, more elaborate form of divine torment, the great, unwieldy sail would be hoisted. This was no simple task. It involved a coordinated effort of hauling, grunting, and swearing from most of the crew, as the heavy canvas, stiff with salt and patches, reluctantly climbed the mast. Then came the endless, minute adjustments to catch the fickle breeze, the constant battle with the tiller to maintain a course that was less a straight line and more a drunken meander towards their distant and often hypothetical destination. Navigation was an art form combining keen observation of coastal landmarks when visible, a rudimentary understanding of the stars when not obscured by clouds or the captain's crippling anxiety, and a healthy dose of blind faith. There were no compasses, no sextants, just Theophilos's gut, the accumulated and often contradictory wisdom of previous generations of equally lost sailors, and the fervent hope that the gods weren't feeling particularly mischievous that day. Hours would crawl by, marked only by the shifting sun, the changing watch, and the gnawing hunger that the morning's pathetic meal had done little to assuage. Lunch, if it happened, was usually a repeat of breakfast, perhaps with the added excitement of finding a weevil in your barley cake, a tiny bonus protein. The afternoon might bring more sail adjustments, more bilge pumping if the sea slug was feeling particularly incontinent, or perhaps the thrilling task of repatching a section of the sail that had decided to emulate a prayer flag in a stiff breeze. If becalmed, a state of windless, sun-baked purgatory, the crew might be set to scrubbing the decks, a futile endeavor, as they'd be filthy again in hours, mending nets. Even if they weren't fishing, nets were always in need of mending, or simply staring out at the glassy, indifferent sea, their hopes for a quick voyage, slowly dissolving like salt in water. This enforced idleness was almost worse than hard labor. It gave too much time for Ficker to the myriad ways they could die. As dusk approached, bringing with it a deceptive beauty as the sun bled into the western sea, the anxiety would ratchet up. Night sailing was perilous. Landmarks disappeared, the stars could be obscured, and the risk of colliding with another vessel or an uncharted reef increased tenfold. Another meager meal would be consumed, the watered wine perhaps a little less watered as a concession to the coming darkness. Watches would be set, the off-duty crew collapsing wherever they could find a sliver of deck space not already occupied by cargo, rats, or puddles of indeterminate origin. Theophilos himself would rarely get more than a few hours of broken sleep, his mind always half attuned to the sounds of the ship, the feel of the wind, the endless murmur of the sea that was both his livelihood and his most persistent enemy. Meaningful breaks? Those were the brief, terrifying moments when everyone stopped what they were doing because something truly awful had just happened. A spar cracking, a man overboard, the unmistakable silhouette of a pirate ship on the horizon. Compared to that, the relentless grinding toil was almost a comfort. The natural environment wasn't a picturesque backdrop for this daily drama. It was an active, often malicious antagonist. The Mediterranean, so beloved by poets for its wine-dark beauty, was, from Theophilos's perspective, a bipolar tyrant with a mean streak a mile wide and a deeply personal grudge against small, struggling merchant vessels. One day it might feign benevolence, offering gentle swells and a steady breeze that almost made you believe in the possibility of profit. The next, it would transform, without warning, into a raging white-capped monster, its waves like liquid mountains intent on smashing your hull to kindling, its winds screaming like tortured souls, its rain lashing down with the force of 1,000 angry Poseidons. Theophilos had seen waves so large they blocked out the sky, their crests foaming with malevolent glee as they bore down on the sea slug, each one a potential watery grave. He'd learned to read the subtle signs of its shifting moods, the particular shade of green in the pre-storm sky, the unnatural stillness of the air, the agitated behavior of the seabirds. But this knowledge only amplified the dread, offering a preview of the coming torment, rather than a means of escape. And the sun, oh, the glorious, life-giving Mediterranean sun. From the deck of the sea slug, it was less a benevolent deity and more a celestial blacksmith's forge, relentlessly hammering down, baking the pitch in the seams until it bubbled, turning the deck into a scorching griddle, and slowly cooking Theophilos's brain inside his skull. There was no escape from its glare, which bounced off the water with a blinding intensity that left his eyes perpetually red-rimmed and aching. It bleached the sails, cracked the timbers, and withered the spirits of the crew, reminding them that even on the clearest day, the heavens could be hostile. The wind, that supposed ally of the sailor, was a fickle, untrustworthy rogue. One moment it was a hot, enervating sirocco blowing up from the Libyan desert, filling the sails with sand and the scent of desolation, making every movement an effort. The next, it could be a bone-chilling tramontana sweeping down from the northern mountains, its icy breath promising hypothermia and a miserable, shivering end. Sometimes, for its own perverse amusement, it would vanish entirely, leaving the sea slug becalmed for days, or even weeks, a tiny forgotten speck adrift on an endless shimmering expanse of blue, the crew slowly succumbing to thirst, hunger, and a profound existential despair as they watched their provisions dwindle and their hopes evaporate under the merciless sun. Even the calm was an enemy, a suffocating blanket of inaction that bred tension and fear. The sensory experience aboard the Sea Slug was a constant, multi-layered assault on human endurance, an olfactory and auditory nightmare meticulously designed to erode sanity. The ship itself was a symphony of suffering, its timbers groaning and creaking with every swell, like an old man with bad joints, a sound that could be either a mundane accompaniment to the voyage or the ominous prelude to the vessel spectacularly disemboweling itself. The rhythmic slap-slap-slap of waves against the hull was a constant hypnotic drumbeat, occasionally punctuated by the much more alarming crump of a larger wave striking like a battering ram, sending shudders through the entire frame and reminding everyone of their precarious hold on existence. Add to this the incessant, mournful whine of the wind in the rigging, a sound like a chorus of banshees lamenting lost prophets, the sharp crack of the sail as it caught a gust, the frantic shouts of the crew during any minor or major crisis, and the low, guttural curses of men pushed beyond their limits of patience and sobriety. In moments of extreme peril, the roar of the storm would drown out everything else. A terrifying, all-encompassing vortex of sound that seemed to herald the end of the world. Dominating every physical sensation was a pervasive, inescapable dampness. It clung to your clothes, your bedding, if you were grand enough to have such a thing, your food, your very soul. Even when the sun blazed, the sea spray, the nocturnal dew, and the ship's inherent leakiness ensured that nothing was ever truly dry. This constant moisture bred mildew, encouraged rot, and chilled you to the bone during night watches, regardless of the season. Seasickness, of course, was a frequent and unwelcome passenger, particularly for new crew members, or during rough weather, turning the simple act of standing upright into a heroic struggle against your own rebellious stomach. The deck would be slick with vomit, adding another delightful layer to the ship's already complex aroma. Sunburn was a constant companion, peeling skin revealing raw, tender flesh beneath, while windburn chafed exposed faces until they felt like sandpaper. Salt caked everything, your skin, your hair, your clothes, leading to infuriating itches and painful sores that refused to heal in the damp, unhygienic conditions. The rough-spun wool of your tunic, your only garment, would rub against your salt-encrusted skin, creating abrasions in places you'd rather not discuss. And your muscles, oh, your poor, abused muscles, would scream in protest from the endless hauling of ropes, the constant bracing against the ship's violent motion, the Herculean effort of wrestling with the steering oars, or the mind-numbing repetition of pumping the bilge. Every sunrise brought a fresh catalog of aches and pains, a physical inventory of the previous day's torment. And the smells. Gods, the smells. The Sea Slug was less a vessel of commerce and more a floating testament to olfactory endurance. The dominant note in this complex bouquet was, naturally, eau d'ancien mariner's armpit, a pungent blend of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and the lingering aroma of fear, all marinating for weeks in close quarters. Underpinning this was the rich, musty fragrance of the bilge, a charming concoction of stagnant seawater, rotting food scraps, fish guts, rat droppings, and quite possibly the ghostly essence of sailors who hadn't quite made it. Depending on the cargo, this could be overlaid with the sweet, cloying scent of wine beginning to turn to vinegar, the dusty smell of damp grain slowly succumbing to mold, or the truly unforgettable stench of a consignment of salted fish that had decided to go rogue and embrace a second, more aggressive putrefaction. Add to this the sharp, acrid tang of bird droppings from the ever-present gulls, the oily aroma of pitch used for repairs, and the faint, metallic scent of rust from any iron fittings, and you had an atmosphere that could make a vulture lose its appetite. It was a miasma of misery, a constant reminder that you were trapped in a small, floating pocket of decay, far from the sweet-smelling meadows and fresh air of land. How Theophilos and his crew managed to consume food in such an environment without their stomachs staging a full-scale mutiny remains one of the great unsung miracles of ancient seafaring. All right, let's peel back another layer of this ancient onion of suffering and examine the magnificent state of the art, for 300 BCE, which isn't saying much, equipment that our hero Theophilos relied upon. If you're picturing finely crafted instruments and robust, dependable machinery, you're sailing in the wrong millennium. The tools of an ancient Greek merchant were frequently another source of profound misery, each with its own unique personality, usually skewed towards the homicidal. First and foremost, pride of place in this gallery of grievances goes to the ship itself, the aforementioned sea slug. This wasn't some sleek, oar-powered trireme cutting through the waves with military precision. Oh no. The sea slug was a holcus, a round-hulled, tubby sort of merchant vessel, designed with the primary aim of holding as much cargo as possible, and a secondary, far less critical aim of occasionally reaching its destination without sinking. She was old, probably built decades before Theophilos inherited her debts. Her timbers of fir or pine groaning under the strain of countless voyages, and even more numerous haphazard repairs. Her hull planks, held together by a complex system of mortise and tenon joints and an alarming quantity of rope, were sealed with pitch, a sticky black substance that had an unfortunate habit of cracking in the cold and melting into goo under the Mediterranean sun, thereby creating new and exciting opportunities for the Aegean to come aboard. Leaks weren't occasional events. They were the sea slug's resting state, her way of reminding everyone that she was, at heart, more submarine than surface vessel. Her personality was that of a profoundly stubborn, arthritic, and deeply pessimistic old mule, prone to wheezing fits, the sound of water gurgling in the bilge, sudden, inexplicable lurches to port or starboard, and a general aura of weary resignation, as if she, too, was just waiting for it all to be over. She conspired against Theophilos by, for instance, developing a fresh, gushing leak miles from any visible land, precisely when a storm was brewing, and half the crew were already incapacitated by seasickness. Or her single, massive mast, a venerable pine trunk that had seen better centuries, would emit a series of ominous creaks and groans that sounded suspiciously like, "I'm about to snap and impale you all." The twin steering oars, cumbersome planks mounted on either side of the stern, were less a guidance system and more a form of isometric torture for the poor souls tasked with wrestling them against the relentless pressure of the sea. If one of these crucial rudders broke or became unshipped in heavy seas, a depressingly common occurrence, the sea slug would devolve into an ungovernable spinning top, usually heading directly for the nearest collection of sharp rocks or pirate-infested cove. Then we have the humble amphora, the workhorse of ancient Mediterranean trade. These large terracotta jars, with their characteristic two handles and tapering bases, were the era's equivalent of the modern shipping container, designed to transport everything from wine and olive oil, the lifeblood of Greek commerce, to grain, salted fish, olives, and even occasionally luxury goods like honey or garum, a fermented fish sauce whose aroma could probably strip paint. While seemingly robust, these clay behemoths were in reality fragile divas, demanding constant coddling and prone to dramatic cargo-spilling tantrums if mishandled. Each one, when full, could weigh well over 100 pounds, making their loading and unloading a back-breaking exercise in precision and brute force. Their pointed bases were designed to be wedged into sand or special knee stands, or, on board ship, nestled tightly together in the hold, often in multiple layers. The personality of a hold full of amphorae was that of 1,000 sleeping, irritable giants. One poorly secured jar, one unexpected lurch of the ship, and you could trigger a catastrophic domino effect of shattering pottery, the sound of which, a chorus of dull thuds and sharp cracks, followed by the glug, glug, glug of escaping liquid, was the stuff of Theophilos's darkest nightmares. Imagine the sheer joy of discovering that your consignment of finest Chian wine, representing months of potential profit, had decided to anoint the bilge with its fragrant presence, creating a sticky, alcoholic swamp that would perfume the ship for the remainder of the voyage and attract every fly within a 10-mile radius. The careful art of stowing amphorae, using ropes, dunnage, and sheer ingenuity to prevent them from shifting, was a critical skill, and one that, if neglected, could lead not only to financial ruin, but also to the dangerous destabilization of the vessel. Let us not forget the sail, the sea slug's primary means of propulsion, assuming the wind wasn't feeling actively malevolent. This was typically a single, large, square sail, laboriously woven from flax linen or, in cheaper, more desperate times, stitched together from animal hides. This magnificent and often heavily patched sheet of fabric possessed all the aerodynamic finesse of a discarded tablecloth. Its personality was that of a temperamental and wildly unpredictable stage actor. On calm days, when even a zephyr would have been a blessing, it would hang limp and lifeless, a saggy monument to inertia, refusing to catch so much as a hopeful sigh, leaving the sea slug to bob aimlessly like a discarded cork. Theophilos would stare at it, willing it to fill, perhaps even offering silent, increasingly desperate prayers to Iolus. But let a sudden squall approach, and this same sail would greedily gulp down the gale, transforming into a raging, straining monster, its fabric threatening to rip from its bolt ropes, the mast groaning under the immense pressure, the entire ship heeling over at an alarming angle. Trying to reef or lower this bucking behemoth in a rising storm, with icy rain lashing down, the deck pitching like a drunken dancer, and ropes slicing through bare, slippery hands, was a recurring nightmare that often resulted in broken fingers, lost teeth, and a renewed appreciation for solid ground. The rigging itself, a complex spiderweb of ropes, made from papyrus fibers, flax, or sometimes horsehair, that controlled the sail and supported the mast, was in a perpetual state of near failure. Ropes would fray with alarming speed, stretch unevenly, snap at the most inconvenient moments, usually when under maximum tension, or tie themselves into Gordian knots that would defy the efforts of the most patient sailor, often requiring a knife and another costly replacement. And what of the anchor, that vital tool for preventing your ship from becoming an unintended visitor in someone's coastal villa? Forget modern, scientifically designed steel claws. Theophilos's anchor was likely a very large, uncooperative stone, carefully selected for its weight and awkwardness, or perhaps a more advanced model consisting of a wooden stock with weighted arms, sometimes tipped with bronze or iron if he was feeling particularly extravagant. Its personality was that of a profoundly lazy and occasionally malicious customs official. When you desperately needed it to grip the seabed in a rising wind as you sought shelter in an unfamiliar bay, it would often drag along the bottom with infuriating indifference, offering all the holding power of a wet sponge in a hurricane. The sea slug would skate perilously close to rocks or a lee shore, while the crew heaved and cursed, trying to coax the stubborn lump of stone or wood to bite. Conversely, on those rare occasions when it did decide to take hold, it often did so with such an enthusiastic embrace of a rocky crevice or a submerged ancient ruin that no amount of hauling, swearing, or sacrificial offerings to minor sea deities could persuade it to let go. More than one merchant had been forced to cut a valuable anchor loose, consigning it to Poseidon's collection and adding, "Procure new anchor, and try not to weep at the cost," to their already lengthy list of anxieties. Alongside this, the sounding lead, a fist-sized lump of lead, often with a hollowed-out base filled with tallow to pick up samples of the seabed, was his primary defense against running aground. Constantly heaving this overboard on a marked line, feeling for the telltale thud of the bottom and hauling it back in, hand over hand, often in choppy seas, was just another monotonous, muscle-straining joy in a long list of maritime delights. It was simple, yes, but if your attention wavered, or if you misjudged the drift of the ship, the next sound you heard might be the sickening crunch of hull on rock. Navigational instruments were a grand term for what largely amounted to keen eyesight, when not blurred by sun glare or fatigue, a good memory for coastal profiles, assuming you'd been that way before and it wasn't foggy, and an almost mystical reliance on the flight patterns of birds or the color of the water. At night, if the sky was clear, Theophilos would squint at constellations like Ursa Major and Minor to get a rough sense of direction. There was no magnetic compass, no chronometer, no GPS. Distance and speed were guesstimates based on experience and hope. It was less a science and more a form of high-stakes divination, where a wrong guess could lead you hundreds of miles off course, into pirate-infested waters, or onto the dinner plate of some particularly large and unfriendly sea monster, or so the more lurid tales claimed. The instrument was largely Theophilos himself, his brain a repository of landmarks, currents, and prevailing winds, all cross-referenced with a healthy dose of fear and an uncanny ability to smell land or trouble from a surprising distance. As for his state-of-the-art personal protective equipment, this is where the humor really darkens. Theophilos faced the fury of the Aegean, the splintering timber, and the general chaos of a small ship in a big storm dressed primarily in a chiton, a short sleeveless woolen tunic that offered about as much protection from a falling block or a rogue wave as a damp Kleenex. When the weather turned particularly foul, or the nights grew bitter, he might add a himation, a larger rectangular woolen cloak, which could be artfully draped to provide a modicum of warmth, or used as a makeshift blanket, a sail patch in an emergency, or, in the direst circumstances, a rather inadequate shroud. These garments, constantly soaked in salt water, stiff with grime, and rarely, if ever properly washed, would chafe his skin raw. Waterproofing was a fantastical concept, belonging to the realm of myths and legends. His footwear, if he wore any on deck, would be simple leather sandals, which, on a wet and pitching surface, transformed into miniature personal water slides, offering an express route to an unplanned overboard excursion. Protection from the relentless baking sun might come from a broad-brimmed straw or felt hat called a patassos, assuming it hadn't been whipped away by the wind, and offered as a sacrifice to the Boreas. Helmets to guard against falling debris, steel-toed boots to protect feet from rolling amphorae, safety harnesses to prevent being washed overboard. These were luxuries so far beyond his reality, they weren't even dreamable. He was expected to meet the myriad dangers of his profession with little more than his wits, his rapidly deteriorating reflexes, and a growing conviction that every god in the pantheon had a personal vendetta against him. And yet, despite this daily litany of failures, betrayals, and outright assassination attempts by the very objects designed to facilitate his livelihood, these accursed tools were his entire world. Theophilos would curse the leaky hull of the sea slug with the inventive profanity of a man who had spent far too much time contemplating its many flaws, but he would also spend countless hours personally overseeing its patching, stuffing new combinations of pitch, tallow, and shredded rags into its weeping seams, driven by the desperate hope that this time, it might hold. He'd scream impotently at the sail when it refused to fill or threatened to tear itself to ribbons, then spend tedious, eye-straining hours with a needle and coarse thread, meticulously stitching its wounds, his fingers clumsy and sore. The amphorae that shattered, each crack a fresh stab in his financial heart, were nonetheless the very vessels that carried the promise of future sustenance. So he learned to oversee their stowage with the obsessive care of a mother hen, muttering prayers to any deity who specialized in the preservation of fragile pottery. It was an unholy matrimony, a toxic codependency forged in shared misery, constant anxiety, and a profound mutual disrespect between man and his utterly inadequate, actively hostile equipment. He depended on them. He loathed them with every fiber of his being, and he poured his sweat, his blood, and his dwindling reserves of optimism into keeping them just barely functional enough not to consign him and his crew to a watery grave before they reached Alexandria, or at least not all of them, on this particular voyage. If our long-suffering merchant, Theophilos, somehow managed to navigate the treacherous waters of the Aegean, evade the enthusiastic attentions of pirates, and keep the perpetually sinking sea slug from achieving its true calling as an artificial reef, he still had to contend with an even more insidious enemy, his own body and mind, both actively rebelling against the relentless abuse of his chosen profession. This wasn't a graceful aging process. This was a speed run towards becoming a walking, groaning museum of occupational hazards, a cautionary tale whispered by old sailors in dimly lit taverns. Let's begin with the magnificent ruin that was his physical form. By the time Theophilus reached what a pampered Athenian philosopher might consider the prime of life, say, his mid-30s, his body was already a creaking, aching testament to years spent battling gravity, heavy objects, and the sadistic whims of Poseidon. His spine, once reasonably straight, now bore the distinctive curvature of a man who had spent too long stooped over a tiller, peering at faded charts, or trying to find a vaguely comfortable position on a deck that offered all the ergonomic support of a bag of broken amphorae. Each vertebra seemed to have a personal vendetta against its neighbors, grinding and clicking with every movement, sending jolts of fiery pain down his legs that made him gasp and curse the day his ancestor first thought owning a boat was a sound financial strategy. His joints, shoulders rotator cuffed from wrestling with the heavy square sail in sudden squalls, elbows perpetually inflamed from hauling on stubborn ropes, knees shot from years of bracing against the violent pitching of the ship, and wrists that throbbed with a dull, persistent ache from gripping the steering oars for hours on end, sang a daily chorus of agony. This symphony of suffering, a cacophony of pops, clicks, and deep, resonant groans, was his constant companion, a reminder that every drachma earned was paid for with a piece of his own physical integrity. He might try rubbing some rancid olive oil into the offending joints, a folk remedy as ineffective as praying for fair winds during a hurricane, but mostly he just endured, his face a mask of stoic misery. Hernias, those delightful protrusions of internal organs through weakened abdominal walls, were practically a guild membership badge for seasoned mariners. Theophilos likely acquired his first one during a particularly enthusiastic attempt to single-handedly shift a crate of surprisingly dense marble votive offerings that had broken loose in heavy seas. The sudden, searing pain, followed by the appearance of a new, unwelcome bulge in his groin, was just another exciting chapter in his ongoing saga of physical decay. In an era devoid of surgical repair for such indignities, his treatment probably consisted of a tightly bound strip of linen, which did little to alleviate the discomfort and a lot to chafe his already irritated skin. Every cough, every strain, every awkward movement was a fresh reminder of this internal betrayal, a ticking time bomb of potential strangulation and a truly agonizing death far from any skilled physician. And his hands. Oh, those magnificent ruined instruments of his trade. They were less flesh and blood and more gnarled, weathered oak branches, permanently stained with pitch, fish scales, salt, and the faint, rusty patina of old blood, both his and the fish's. The skin was a crazy quilt of calluses as thick as old shoe leather, crisscrossed with a dense network of faded white scars from countless encounters with splintered wood, razor-sharp edges of broken pottery, and ropes that could strip flesh from bone with the casual malevolence of a hungry shark. His fingernails, if he still possessed a full set, would be perpetually cracked, blackened with grime, and likely harboring a thriving microbial civilization. Gripping anything, from a steering oar that fought him like a wild beast to a simple cup of watered wine, was an exercise in controlled agony, his knuckles swollen, his fingers stiff and uncooperative. His feet, those poor neglected appendages, were even worse off, constantly damp from bilge water, sea spray, or the cold sweat of fear. They were pale, wrinkled, and perpetually on the verge of succumbing to some new and fascinating fungal infection. Amphora foot, a charming condition caused by dropping heavy jars on one's extremities, was common, as was deck splinter surprise, which was exactly as delightful as it sounds. The constant exposure to corrosive saltwater would create a constellation of stinging, weeping sores, while the relentless sun, that celestial sadist, would bake his exposed skin into a cracked, leathery parody of what it once was. Deep furrows, like dry riverbeds, radiated from the corners of his eyes, testament to years spent squinting against the blinding glare of the sun on water. He probably looked like a poorly preserved mummy long before he hit 40. His eyes, indeed, were another casualty. The constant, unrelenting glare from the sea, even on overcast days, would leave them red-rimmed, perpetually watery, and prone to growths like pterygium, a charming condition where the conjunctiva, in an apparent fit of boredom, attempts to invade the cornea. Night vision would become a distant, cherished memory, making nocturnal navigation even more of a terrifying crapshoot than it already was. The world would slowly, almost imperceptibly, acquire a hazy, indistinct quality, as if viewed through a perpetually grimy wineskin. And his teeth, assuming a representative sample still remained in his jaw, were a horrifying monument to a diet consisting mainly of gritty barley cakes, dried fish, tough enough to sole sandals, and a profound and comprehensive ignorance of anything resembling oral hygiene. Cavities were not so much filled as allowed to fester into agonizing abscesses, each throb a fresh insult from the gods of dental torment. Gum disease was so rampant it was practically a fashion statement, and the loss of teeth was simply an accepted milestone on the road to complete physical disintegration. A merchant's smile was less an expression of joy and more a terrifying, gap-toothed glimpse into a future of soft foods and mumbled curses. But it wasn't just the spectacular injuries or the slow, grinding decay of his skeletal framework that Theophilos had to contend with. Oh no. The maritime lifestyle was also a remarkably efficient distributor of fascinating internal afflictions, each with its own unique brand of protracted misery. Dysentery, the dreaded flux, was a frequent and profoundly unwelcome passenger, usually invited aboard by a water supply that had been festering in slowly rotting wooden barrels, or previously used amphorae that had once housed something best left undisturbed, like, say, fermenting fish guts for garum production. The sudden, violent cramping that felt like his intestines were being tied in knots by a malevolent nymph. The bloody, watery stool that drained his strength and dignity. The terrifying dehydration that left his tongue cleaving to the roof of his mouth. It was a swift, brutal, and deeply undignified way to meet Hades. Shipboard remedies might involve infusions of pomegranate rind or other astringent herbs, which did little more than make the experience taste slightly more bitter. Victims were often too weak to even lift their heads, their life literally and messily draining away, while their shipmates looked on with a mixture of pity and a desperate fear of contagion. Fevers were another common shipboard companion, arriving with little warning and consuming their victims with a terrifying intensity. While malaria might be more readily associated with the swampy environs of certain ports like the Nile Delta, the sea slug itself, with its collection of stagnant bilge water and forgotten damp corners, could easily become a five-star resort for mosquitoes, carrying all sorts of exciting eggs. One day, Theophilos might be calculating potential profits from a cargo of Spindan wine. The next, he'd be shivering uncontrollably beneath a pile of damp wool cloaks, his teeth chattering like dice in a cup, his body alternating between icy chills and a furnace-like heat that left him delirious, and babbling about phantom sea monsters or creditors with flaming swords. His crew would watch, helpless, perhaps offering sips of foul water or muttering incantations to Asclepius, while silently wondering if they should start drawing lots for his share of the remaining rations. Respiratory ailments were practically a job requirement. The constant exposure to damp, salty air, the biting chill of night watches, and the cozy, mold-infested nooks within the sea slug's ancient hull were a perfect recipe for chronic, rattling coughs that felt like his lungs were trying to escape his ribcage, bronchitis that left him wheezing like a punctured wineskin, or full-blown pneumonia that could fill his lungs with fluid and quietly snuff out his life far from any physician's dubious care. Every breath could be a struggle, every gust of wind a fresh assault on his already compromised respiratory system. And let's not forget the insidious, ongoing joys of chronic malnutrition and dehydration. The standard shipboard diet, those infamous barley cakes that could double as emergency ballast, dried fish that tasted like salty leather straps, a few wizened olives that had seen better decades, and wine so heavily watered it was mostly just a rumor of grapes, was hardly designed to fuel weeks of relentless physical labor and unceasing psychological stress. Vitamin deficiencies would lead to bleeding gums, scurvy's less dramatic cousin, skin that bruised at the slightest touch, impaired night vision, and a general lack of vitality that made every task feel like wading through treacle. Fresh water was a precious, jealously guarded commodity, often tasting strongly of the pitch used to seal its container, or faintly of algae, or simply of despair. Dehydration was a constant, lurking threat, especially under the blazing Mediterranean sun, leading to splitting headaches, dizziness that made standing on a pitching deck even more precarious, and a level of profound, bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of fitful, interrupted sleep could ever truly alleviate. Every day was a battle against a weariness so profound, it felt like his very soul was being ground down into a fine, tasteless dust, leaving him feeling hollowed out and ancient before his time. While his body was engaged in this constant losing campaign against the elements, its own inherent frailties, and a diet that would make a goat weep, his mind was fighting its own silent, desperate war in the echoing emptiness of the open sea. There was the ever-present, low-frequency hum of fear, a constant companion that whispered insidious suggestions of sudden storms, unseen reefs lurking just beneath the waves, the glint of a pirate's blade in the moonlight, or the sickening lurch of shifting cargo that signaled impending financial ruin and a very wet grave. Every creak of the sea slug's timbers, every unexpected snap of a rope, every distant, unidentified sail on the horizon could send a jolt of icy adrenaline through his already frayed nervous system. This wasn't the heroic thrill of adventure often sung about by land-bound poets. It was the grinding, ulcer-inducing anxiety of a man perpetually walking a rotten tightrope over a sea teeming with sharks, all while juggling a cargo of fragile, uninsured pottery and a mountain of debt. He might try to mask it with a gruff exterior, but Theophilos lived on a knife edge of apprehension. His stomach perpetually clenched, his senses hyper-alert for the next sign of impending disaster. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing monotony, days upon days, sometimes weeks, of seeing nothing but the same endless, indifferent expanse of the sea, the same creaking mast swaying against the same empty sky, the same tired, anxious faces of his crew. The tasks, while often physically demanding, were mind-numbingly repetitive. Haul this rope, pump that bilge, scrub that deck, again, stare at that horizon. The conversations, when they happened, were usually limited to curses, complaints about the food, or grim speculations about their chances of survival. It was an existence that could dull the sharpest intellect and blunt the most resilient spirit, leaving a hollow, echoing weariness where ambition and hope had once resided. Sometimes, Theophilos would find himself staring blankly at the waves for hours, his mind a desolate landscape, wondering if this was all there was. An endless cycle of risk and discomfort, punctuated by moments of sheer terror, all for the dubious privilege of maybe, just maybe, not starving next year. For all his supposed status as a merchant, a man nominally in charge of his own vessel and destiny, he was profoundly lacking in any real agency. The winds, the waves, the currents, the structural integrity, or lack thereof, of the ancient sea slug, the whims of the market, the greed of port officials, the ever-present threat of pirates, these were the true masters of his fate. He was a tiny speck of humanity, a fragile ego adrift on a vast ocean of forces, far beyond his control. This constant awareness of his own powerlessness could easily curdle into a corrosive cynicism, a bleak fatalism that saw every sunrise not as a new beginning, but as simply another day to endure, another 24 hours in which things could, and probably would, go disastrously wrong. What was the point of careful planning when a single rogue wave or an unseen sandbar could obliterate everything in an instant? The isolation, even when surrounded by a small crew, could be profound. Far from the familiar embrace of Athens, his family, the bustling agora, and the relative safety of dry land, the sea became a vast, empty wilderness, a watery desert that stretched to infinity in every direction. News from the wider world was months old, if it arrived at all, carried by other equally stressed and unreliable merchants. The faces around him were often those of rough, unlettered sailors, men whose concerns rarely extended beyond the next meager meal or the next port with its promise of cheap wine and fleeting female companionship. Meaningful intellectual or emotional connection was a rare and precious commodity. Worries about his wife and children back home, about debts mounting, about the leaky roof of his modest dwelling, would gnaw at him during the long dark watches, unanswered and unanswerable. To cope with this psychological onslaught, Theophilos likely developed a repertoire of grim superstitions and desperate rituals. He'd make small, pathetic offerings to Poseidon before setting sail, perhaps a splash of his best or least worst wine into the waves, or a muttered prayer to Hermes, the god of merchants, travelers, and thieves, a rather telling combination that, for a profitable and, more importantly, survivable voyage, he might carry a worn lucky knucklebone, or avoid whistling on deck for fear of summoning a storm, or interpret the flight of seabirds as omens of good or ill fortune. Dark humor, as black and bitter as the dregs of week-old wine, undoubtedly became a common currency among the crew, a way to laugh in the grimacing face of constant peril and shared misery. "Well, at least if we sink here," one sailor might quip as they bailed frantically in a rising gale, "the fish will eat well tonight." Perhaps he found a temporary, fuzzy oblivion in an extra cup of watered wine when the day's terrors were briefly held at bay. Or maybe he just retreated deeper into a fortress of stoic resignation, his inner world a bleak landscape of carefully managed despair, punctuated only by flashes of impotent anger at the gods, the weather, his creditors, or his own foolish decision to follow in his father's waterlogged footsteps. The gleam of potential profit, the distant dream of financial security, had to be a very, very strong beacon indeed to navigate this relentless ocean of physical and mental suffering. It's a wonder he didn't just steer the sea slug towards the nearest deserted island and declare himself king of the crabs. Surviving the relentless onslaught of the elements, the treachery of his own vessel, and the slow decay of his body was only part of Theophilos's daily struggle. For even if he mastered these, he then had to face the labyrinthine, often infuriating world of human interaction. In his experience, other people, be they superiors, subordinates, officials, or competitors, were frequently just another species of barnacle, clinging, irritating, and remarkably difficult to scrape off. Forget the lofty ideals of Athenian democracy and reasoned discourse. The human element in maritime commerce was a messy, grasping, and often brutally pragmatic affair, where a sharp tongue and a judiciously placed bribe were far more valuable than any philosophical insight. Let's begin with those who ostensibly shared his commercial ambitions, but rarely any of the actual risk: the financiers, partners, and assorted land-based parasites back in Athens. These were often men of some means, perhaps minor aristocrats, who found manual labor distasteful, but profit quite appealing, or older, established merchants who now preferred the comfort of their city villas to the unpredictable embrace of the Aegean. To them, Theophilos and the sea slug were not so much a brave enterprise charting the course of Hellenic commerce, as they were a slightly unreliable donkey carrying their precious figs to market. Their communications, when they bothered to communicate at all, usually arrived via slow boat, penned on expensive papyrus by scribes, whose elegant script only highlighted the inelegance of the demands within. To Theophilos, greetings, if indeed you are still afloat and haven't squandered our investment on cheap Thracian wine. One such missive might begin. We note with some considerable alarm the tardiness of your return from Alexandria. The price of grain is volatile, and your delay is costing us dearly. We trust you have a most compelling reason for this dilatoriness, and that the sea slug, a vessel in which we remind you we have a significant stake, has not developed any further of its charming eccentricities. See to it that your next cargo is of premium quality, and that your accounts are, for once, impeccable. Signed, the Council of Concerned Investors, and your increasingly impatient brother-in-law, Philocrates. Occasionally, these luminaries would dispatch an agent to accompany a voyage or oversee the loading of particularly valuable cargo. These individuals were usually nephews who couldn't be trusted with anything important on land, or meticulously robed scribes whose primary maritime skill was looking down their long noses at the sweaty, profane business of actually getting goods onto a ship. Theophilos would have to endure their endless, ignorant questions. Are you quite certain that stacking the amphorae in that manner aligns with the principles of advanced geometry, Captain? And their unhelpful suggestions. Perhaps if the crew sang a more motivational sea shanty, the loading would proceed with greater alacrity. The urge to have such a person inspect the anchor chain from the seabed up must have been a constant, simmering temptation. The sheer lack of understanding of the brutal realities of sea travel was galling. A storm was an inconvenience that delayed profits, not a life or death struggle against the primal fury of nature. A pirate attack was a regrettable write-off, not a scene of bloody terror and potential enslavement. Then, of course, there were the officials, the gatekeepers of every port from the Piraeus to the Pharos of Alexandria. Each harbor was its own unique ecosystem of bureaucratic torment and institutionalized extortion. Harbor masters, portly men with an air of immense self-importance and hands perpetually outstretched, would materialize as soon as the sea slug limped into view, demanding docking fees that seemed to fluctuate with their mood and the perceived desperation of the arriving captain. Ah, Captain Theophilos, a pleasure to see the sea slug gracing our humble port once more, one might say, his eyes already calculating the cubic tonnage of Theophilos's vessel and the probable contents of his coin purse. The usual berthing fee, of course, plus the new contribution for the upcoming festival of Poseidon's gouty toe, and a small emolument for the swift processing of your paperwork. Theophilos learned early that arguing was futile and often counterproductive, leading only to mysterious delays and even more mysterious new levies. Customs officials were a special breed, viewing every arriving merchant as a potential smuggler, and every cargo manifest as a work of imaginative fiction. They would descend upon his goods with the suspicious scrutiny of a hawk eyeing a particularly plump field mouse, tapping amphorae, sniffing suspiciously at bales of linen, and meticulously counting every last item, their expressions ranging from bored indifference to outright accusation. This manifest declares 100 jars of lesbian wine, Captain. Yet my esteemed colleague here counts only 99 that are fully intact. A discrepancy, wouldn't you agree? Such discrepancies carry rather hefty penalties, unless, of course, a satisfactory explanation can be provided. The explanation, naturally, usually involved a discreet transfer of silver from Theophilos's dwindling funds into the official's conveniently open palm. It was a degrading, infuriating dance, repeated in every port, a constant drain on his resources and his already frayed patience. He often wondered if these officials practiced their expressions of sanctimonious avarice in front of polished bronze mirrors, and if, by some alignment of benevolent stars and well-placed bribes, Theophilos actually managed to get his cargo unloaded and through customs. He then had to face the buyers. This was where the real psychological warfare began. Whether in the bustling markets of Alexandria, the crowded quays of Rhodes, or the smaller, more cutthroat emporia of the Aegean islands, buyers were a universally cynical and hard-nosed lot. They would circle his offerings, the wine he'd risked his life to transport, the olive oil that represented months of his family's labor, the pottery he'd carefully guarded against breakage, with the predatory air of vultures assessing a dying goat. Athenian black figure wear, one might sniff, picking up a finely crafted kylix. A bit derivative, isn't it? And is that a slight chip on the rim I detect? Clearly second rate. I might be persuaded to take it off your hands. For half your asking price, of course. As a personal favor. They would disparage the quality, question the provenance, lament the state of the market, and generally do everything in their power to drive the price down to a level that barely covered Theophilos's costs, let alone generated a profit. if he appeared too eager to sell, or if word got out that he was running low on provisions and desperate to begin his return voyage before the weather turned, they would pounce, their offers plummeting like a stone. Theophilos had to cultivate a mask of stony indifference, engage in elaborate rituals of feigned offense and reluctant concession, and pray to Hermes, god of merchants and tricksters, that he wouldn't end up selling his precious cargo for less than he'd paid for the amphory it came in. The sheer, unadulterated lack of appreciation for the effort and danger involved was a constant, bitter pill. Did any of his investors ever clap him on the back and say, "By Zeus, Theophilos, navigating that storm off Cape Malea with only one steering oar and half a sail? That was masterful. Have an extra bonus." The notion was laughable. A successful voyage, cargo delivered intact and on time, was merely what was expected. It was the baseline. Any deviation, a delay due to weeks of adverse winds, a portion of the cargo damaged by seawater from that unavoidable leak, a slightly lower market price than anticipated, would bring a deluge of complaints, accusations of incompetence, and thinly veiled threats about future financing. The intricate knowledge of currents and coastlines, the hard-won skill of managing a difficult ship and a motley crew, the sheer nerve it took to face pirates or a Mediterranean tempest. All this was invisible, unquantifiable, and therefore utterly unvalued by those who sat safely on shore counting their drachmas. Theophilos and the sea slug were tools, and if the tool didn't perform perfectly, it was clearly the tool's fault, not the fault of unrealistic expectations or chronically insufficient investment in its upkeep. His reward for bringing a fortune safely to port was usually just the stress of knowing he had to do it all over again. And this time, do it better. Or else. Then there was his crew, his fellow sufferers in this floating purgatory. The half-dozen or so men who sailed the sea slug with him were a mixed bag, drawn from the desperate, the dispossessed, or those who were simply too stupid or too stubborn to find less perilous employment. They were rough, unlettered, often deeply superstitious, and their loyalty was generally to their next meal or their next skinful of wine, not necessarily to Theophilos or the abstract concept of commercial success. Yet, a grim sort of camaraderie could, and often did, flicker to life amidst the shared misery. When the sea slug was being tossed about like a child's toy in a monstrous storm, when every man was clinging on for dear life, bailing water, or wrestling with flailing ropes, a bond forged in terror and adrenaline would emerge. Afterwards, if they survived, there might be a shared, shaky laugh, a communal swig from a past wineskin, an unspoken acknowledgement of having cheated death together. They developed their own dark humor, their jokes often revolving around the captain's, Theophilos's, increasingly gray hair, the ship's uncanny ability to find every submerged rock in the Aegean, or the dubious parentage of certain port officials. Unspoken rules governed their cramped existence. You didn't touch another man's meager rations. You took your turn at the most loathsome tasks without too much complaint, and you didn't, under any circumstances, whistle into the wind unless you actively wanted to summon a typhoon. But the same brutal conditions that bred solidarity could also foster suspicion and conflict. In the claustrophobic confines of the ship, with nerves frayed by lack of sleep and poor food, petty grievances could easily escalate. An accusation of someone not pulling their weight on the ropes, a dispute over a game of dice played for pebbles or stale olive pits, a suspicion that someone was pilfering from the communal waterskin. These could flare into sudden, violent confrontations, with fists flying and knives sometimes drawn. Theophilos, as captain, had to be the arbiter, the judge, and often the enforcer, stepping in to quell disputes with a sharp word, a threat, or if necessary, a demonstration of why he was still, despite his aching back, in charge. It was exhausting. he had to maintain a careful balance between discipline and a grudging respect for his men, knowing that their cooperation, however reluctant, was essential for survival. He knew they grumbled about him behind his back, cursed his decisions, and probably dreamed of mutiny on particularly bad days. He couldn't blame them. He often dreamed of mutinying against himself. In port, Theophilos might occasionally encounter other merchants, captains of their own leaky tubs, their faces etched with the same lines of worry and weather-beaten cynicism. They'd gather in smoky, dimly lit dockside taverns, the air thick with the smell of cheap wine, spilled fish guts, and desperation. Here, they might exchange news, tales of pirate sightings, often exaggerated, warnings about newly discovered reefs, sometimes fabricated to mislead competitors, tips on which port officials were currently the most corruptible, usually all of them, and rumors of shifting market prices for grain, wine, or olive oil. There was a veneer of professional courtesy, a shared understanding of the unique hell that was their chosen profession. They'd complain bitterly about the weather, the taxes, the untrustworthiness of sailors, and the general ingratitude of the world. But beneath this surface layer of commiseration, a current of sharp-elbowed rivalry ran deep. One man's shipwreck was another man's opportunity to sell his identical cargo at an inflated price. If a fellow merchant secured a lucrative contract, the congratulations offered were often tinged with a distinct shade of envious green. They were all sharks circling the same limited pool of resources, and while they might recognize a kindred spirit in another captain's weary eyes, they knew that in the end, it was every man for himself, every ship for its own survival. Trust was a luxury few could afford, and a carelessly spoken word in a tavern could easily be used against you by a competitor eager to gain an edge. It was a lonely, suspicious business, this dance with the sea and the equally treacherous currents of human greed. Ah, the legendary comforts of a life at sea. The Epicurean delights, the spacious and well-appointed cabins, the tranquil nights under a canopy of stars, lulled to sleep by the gentle rocking of the waves. If this is the image that springs to your mind when you picture our Greek merchant Theophilos aboard the Sea Slug, then you have clearly been spending far too much time reading romantic poetry, and not nearly enough time inhaling the fumes of reality that permeated every timber of his wretched vessel. The luxuries afforded to him and his crew were so profoundly, comically awful that they made a Spartan barracks look like a sybaritic paradise. Let's embark on a guided tour of this floating catalog of deprivation. First, let us consider the grim sustenance that fueled their miserable existence, a culinary journey into the heart of despair. The cornerstone of their diet, the very bedrock of their nutritional suffering, was maza. This wasn't the fluffy, leavened bread enjoyed by the more fortunate citizens of Athens. Oh no. Maza was a dense, often gritty barley cake or paste, sometimes unleavened, sometimes poorly leavened, possessing the texture of compacted damp sawdust and the flavor profile of profound regret. It was usually prepared in bulk before a voyage, and as the days and weeks wore on, it would gradually transform, acquiring new and exciting characteristics. A certain greenish hue around the edges from burgeoning mold, a delightful crunchiness from the weevils that had taken up residence within its dense crumb, and an overall aroma that could charitably be described as earthy, if earthy meant smelling vaguely of a damp cellar where something small has died. Theophilos would gnaw on a hunk of this twice a day, his jaws working laboriously, washing it down with a mouthful of something that was, technically, liquid. On special occasions, if the cook, usually the crew member least likely to accidentally poison everyone, was feeling particularly inspired, the maza might be crumbled into water to create a kind of lukewarm, glutinous porridge, its primary virtue being that it was slightly less likely to break your teeth. This Epicurean delight was often accompanied by a handful of olives, typically small, wrinkled, and preserved in brine so salty it could pucker a sphinx. These were less a source of flavor, and more a chewy, monotonous obligation, Then there were the onions and garlic, potent bulbs that provided a welcome sharpness to the otherwise bland fare, and also served as an effective, if unintentional, form of social distancing in the cramped confines of the ship. Their pungent aroma would mingle with the myriad other stenches, creating a uniquely maritime miasma. The main protein source, if you could call it that, was dried, heavily salted fish. We're not talking about delicately smoked salmon here. This was usually some unidentifiable denizen of the deep, caught en masse, gutted hastily, and then subjected to a preservation process involving so much salt that the fish itself was merely a rumor, a desiccated, leathery plank that required the dental fortitude of a hyena to consume. The smell alone could stun a particularly robust seagull at 50 paces, and it often lingered on the fingers and breath for days, a constant fishy reminder of your dietary plight. Sometimes, as a rare treat, especially at the beginning of a voyage, there might be a hunk of hard goat's milk cheese. This would start out passably edible, but, in the warm, damp conditions of the hold, would quickly embark on its own fascinating journey of fermentation, developing a crust of alarming colors and an aroma that could clear the deck faster than a pirate sighting. Fresh fruit or vegetables were but a fleeting dream, a memory of the last port of call, consumed within the first few days before the relentless march of rot and decay set in. And to drink, water, that most basic of human needs, was a constant source of anxiety and gastrointestinal distress. It was stored in porous terracotta amphorae, which imparted a distinctively earthy flavor, or in wooden barrels that had likely seen better days and multiple previous questionable contents. The water quickly became stagnant, warm, and often cloudy with unidentifiable particulate matter. Algae would bloom enthusiastically. Insect larvae would perform leisurely synchronized swimming routines, and the whole concoction would taste faintly, or sometimes strongly, of the pitch used to seal the containers, with subtle notes of despair and impending dysentery. Little wonder that wine, however terrible, was the preferred beverage. This wasn't the fine Pramnian or lesbian vintages celebrated by poets. Shipboard wine was cheap, rough, often acidic, and invariably watered down, a concoction known as crasis. Its primary purpose was not sophisticated enjoyment, but to provide a vaguely palatable alternative to the actively hostile water, to offer a brief, fuzzy respite from the unrelenting misery of existence, and perhaps to kill a few of the more adventurous microbes. It too could go spectacularly wrong on a long voyage, turning to vinegar or developing a film of mold that had to be skimmed off before consumption. The entire unhygienic circus of food storage and preparation, which usually involved a rusty knife, a communal, seldom-washed wooden bowl, and a patch of deck that also served as a walkway, a sleeping area, and an occasional toilet for seasick sailors, meant that stomach ailments were not just a risk. They were practically an integral part of the shipboard experience. Theophilos probably spent a significant portion of each voyage doubled over with cramps, wondering if the last meal was going to make a violent reappearance. Now, let us turn to the luxurious sleeping accommodations aboard the Sea Slug. The term quarters implies a degree of privacy and designated space that would have been laughably alien to Theophilos and his crew. Home, for the duration of the voyage, was usually wherever you could wedge your exhausted body without rolling overboard or being crushed by shifting cargo. This often meant a few square feet of splintered, unforgiving wooden deck, perhaps with a coil of rough rope as a makeshift pillow if you were feeling particularly decadent. Alternatively, one could seek shelter amongst the cargo in the hold, nestled between a phalanx of indifferent amphorae, an option that offered slightly more protection from the elements, but came with its own unique set of discomforts, such as the constant threat of being buried alive if the cargo shifted, the company of rats the size of small cats, and an atmosphere thick with the concentrated aromas of whatever goods were slowly decaying around you. Comfort was a mythical beast, spoken of in hushed tones by sailors who had once, perhaps, spent a night on actual land, Mattresses, blankets, even a simple straw pallet. These were the stuff of dreams, not reality. Your bed was the ship itself, hard, unyielding, and often disturbingly damp from sea spray, nocturnal dew, or the persistent, mournful weeping of the sea slug's leaky hull. Cramped doesn't even begin to articulate the spatial realities. A small merchant vessel like the sea slug, her belly stuffed to bursting with wine jars from Kos, olive oil from Attica, or grain from the Black Sea, left precious little room for her human freight. Sailors and merchants alike would be crammed together like pickled fish in a jar, the intimate aromas of unwashed bodies, stale wine, old fear, and new anxieties creating a rich communal fug that defied description. Exposure to the elements was not a bug, but a feature. A clear, starry night might seem romantic from the safety of a shore-bound villa, but experienced on the open deck of the Sea Slug, it meant a chilling, bone-deep dampness that seeped into your clothes, your joints, your very marrow. Rain, of course, meant being soaked to the skin within minutes, with little hope of drying off for days, leading to chafing, sores, and a persistent, hacking cough. A storm. That was an all-consuming, violent assault, where you clung to whatever solid object you could find, battered by wind and waves, every muscle screaming, convinced that each lurch and plunge would be your last. And let us not forget the ship's other non-paying passengers, the rats. These were not timid, scurrying creatures. These were bold, experienced mariners in their own right, treating the vessel as their personal larder and obstacle course, often using sleeping humans as convenient climbing frames or investigating interesting smells emanating from ears, noses, or open mouths with disconcerting familiarity. Fleas, lice, and an assortment of biting flies were also part of this merry shipboard ecosystem, thriving in the unhygienic conditions and ensuring that any attempt at rest was punctuated by furious, frustrated scratching and a litany of muttered curses invoking various unpleasant fates upon all biting insects and their ancestors. Privacy was a concept so alien it might as well have been from another galaxy. Even the most basic bodily functions were performed with a distinct lack of ceremony and a surplus of exposure, usually over the side of the ship, directly into the wind if your luck was particularly bad that day, much to the amusement or disgust of your fellow sufferers. And sleep itself, that precious restorative balm of hurt minds and aching bodies, it was a rare, precious, and perpetually interrupted commodity, a tantalizing mirage in a desert of exhaustion. The notion that night was for 8 hours of uninterrupted, peaceful slumber was a charming fairy tale told by people who had never tried to share a pitching plank with 3 other snoring, vermin-infested sailors while a cold drizzle seeped into their only tunic. Someone, indeed several someones, always had to stand watch, their eyes straining in the inky darkness for the loom of an unlit coastline, the flicker of a pirate's lamp, or the telltale signs of an approaching squall that could rip their sail to shreds. These watches were typically divided into shifts, ensuring that no one ever achieved more than a few hours of continuous, shallow unconsciousness before being brutally shaken awake to face another round of misery. Even when nominally off watch, true rest was an elusive prize. The constant cacophonous symphony of the ship, the rhythmic creaking and groaning of the timbers as if the sea slug were perpetually in its death throes, the groan of the mast under strain, the relentless slap 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 of waves against the hull, the whistling shriek of the wind in the rigging, the snores and groans and occasional nightmare-induced yelps of fellow crewmen, and the incessant bold scurrying and gnawing of the rats made deep sleep a near impossibility. Then there were the emergencies. A sudden panicked cry of "leak in the hold" would have everyone scrambling from their fitful doze, regardless of the hour, to man the pumps or form a bucket brigade, desperately trying to expel the invading Aegean before it claimed them all. A shift in the wind requiring a rapid adjustment of the heavy sail, a cry of "cargo shifting" portending a potential capsize, or the terrifying yell of "sail ho" in waters known for piracy. These would jolt every man from sleep into a state of adrenaline-fueled panic, stumbling around in the darkness, often soaked to the bone, powered by sheer terror and the dregs of their exhausted reserves. And even if, by some rare miracle, the sea was calm, the ship relatively quiet, and no immediate crisis loomed, the sheer physical discomfort of their sleeping arrangements, the hard, unyielding deck planks pressing into already bruised hips and shoulders, the damp cold that seeped into their bones, the relentless itching from flea bites, the dull throb of overworked muscles, the gnawing pangs of hunger, the lingering nausea of seasickness, all conspired to make deep, restorative slumber a distant, almost mythical concept. The cumulative effect of this chronic, profound sleep deprivation was devastating. Judgment became clouded, making disastrous navigational errors more likely. Reaction times slowed to a glacial pace, a potentially fatal flaw when quick action was needed to avert disaster. Tempers frayed, turning minor irritations into explosive conflicts, and the already monumental exhaustion deepened into a soul-crushing weariness that permeated every aspect of their wretched existence, painting the world in shades of gray despair. It's a testament to human endurance, or perhaps just sheer, stubborn stupidity, that any of them ever woke up at all, let alone found the will to face another day of this luxurious torment. So, our hero Theophilos, captain of the perpetually ailing sea slug, endures a daily existence that would make a particularly stoic rock weep. He battles monstrous seas, eats food condemned by rats, sleeps on planks designed by sadists, and generally lives a life that's a hair's breadth from utter catastrophe. Surely, one might think, such a life of relentless toil and monumental risk must have come with a commensurate financial reward. Perhaps he was secretly amassing a fortune, stashing chests of silver beneath his creaking bunk, dreaming of a comfortable retirement in a sun-drenched villa overlooking the very sea that tormented him. If you believe that, I have a slightly used trireme to sell you. Very low mileage. The stark economic reality for most small-time Greek sea merchants like Theophilos was often just another particularly cruel joke played by an uncaring cosmos. A relentless grind where staying solvent was a victory in itself, and actual wealth was a distant, shimmering mirage. Let's first consider the payment received by the hardy souls who formed Theophilos's crew. The concept of a regular salary, a predictable weekly wage deposited neatly into their wineskins, was as fanciful as a mermaid offering investment advice. Their compensation was a masterclass in creative accounting designed to minimize outlay and maximize, well, not their contentment, certainly. Primarily, there were the daily rations, that gourmet experience we've already dissected, which, while technically having a value, was more about barely staving off starvation than actual remuneration. Beyond this, a sailor might be promised a mistos, a meager, fixed sum for the entire voyage, agreed upon in some dockside tavern, with a handshake and a silent prayer from the sailor that the captain wasn't a complete charlatan. More often, especially on speculative ventures, they were offered a tiny, almost insulting share of the potential profits. This share, often a fraction of a percent, was dangled like a rotten carrot before a starving donkey, a tantalizing possibility that hinged entirely on the voyage not ending in financial or literal disaster. And then there were the deductions. Oh, the glorious, inventive, and utterly infuriating deductions. Did a length of rope fray beyond repair due to age and neglect, but blamed on improper handling. That's coming out of your share, lads. Was an amphora of cheap wine broken when the ship nearly capsized in a storm, clearly sent by an enraged Poseidon, but attributed to careless stowage? Deductible. Was a sailor caught taking an unauthorized nap during a backbreaking rowing session necessitated by a dead calm, a nap induced by sheer, mind-numbing exhaustion, fined for malingering? By the time the sea slug limped back to port, assuming it hadn't become a permanent feature of the seabed, a crewman's theoretical earnings would have been whittled down by 1,000 tiny cuts, leaving him with barely enough to settle his debts with the tavern keeper, purchase a new, second-hand, and equally threadbare tunic, and perhaps offer a small, desperate sacrifice to Hermes, hoping for better luck next time. For most, it wasn't a career. It was a cycle of debt and desperation, ensuring they remained chained to the oar, or in this case, the bilge pump. Theophilos, a man not without a sliver of battered conscience, hated this part of the business, the haggling with men whose poverty was as stark as his own anxieties. But the razor-thin margins of his enterprise left him little choice. For Theophilos himself, the captain and merchant, the financial tightrope walk was even more precarious, the stakes infinitely higher. He was the entrepreneur, the risk-taker, which in ancient Greece often translated to the man most likely to end up destitute or enslaved for debt. To even contemplate a voyage, he first had to secure capital. This usually meant a visit to a back-alley moneylender in Piraeus, a man like Sosigenes, whose eyes held the cold gleam of compound interest and whose smile never quite reached them. Here, Theophilos would negotiate a nautikos tokos, a maritime loan. This wasn't your friendly local building society offering a competitive mortgage. Interest rates on these loans were brutal, reflecting the colossal risks involved. Easily 22.5%, 30%, or even, for particularly perilous routes, or during the stormy fringes of the sailing season, a catastrophic 50% to 100%. The only saving grace, if you could call it that, was the bottomry nature of many such loans. If the ship and cargo were completely lost, the debt was often cancelled. The lender lost their capital. Theophilos only lost his ship, his cargo, his entire livelihood, and quite possibly his life and those of his crew. A small comfort indeed when facing a 30-foot wave. The pressure to make each voyage succeed, just to appease men like Sosigenes, was immense. And the outgoings. Oh, the relentless cascade of expenses that bled his meager resources dry before he'd even sold a single drop of wine. There was the constant weeping sore of ship maintenance. The sea slug devoured funds for new ropes, sailcloth patches, pitch for caulking, and replacement timbers almost as voraciously as it took on seawater. Then came the crew's wages or shares, however pitiful. Provisions, even the awful stuff they ate, had to be bought. Every port levied its own extortionate fees for docking, for anchorage, for merely existing in their waters. Taxes to the city-state, taxes on certain goods, taxes that seemed to be invented on the spot by particularly creative officials. And then the bribes, the endless stream of gifts, facilitation payments, and tokens of esteem required to smooth passage through the sticky fingers of harbor masters, customs inspectors, and various other petty tyrants who could otherwise delay his voyage indefinitely or confiscate his cargo on a whim. A few strategically placed amphorae of his second-best wine often worked wonders, though it pained him to part with potential profit. Finally, there were the obligatory, if often grudging, sacrifices to the gods, a cockerel for Poseidon before a risky passage, a libation for Hermes before a critical negotiation. Because in a world governed by capricious deities, one couldn't afford not to hedge one's bets, however thin the returns. If, after all this, after navigating storms and pirates, after his cargo hadn't spoiled, shattered, or been entirely consumed by the rats, and if he arrived at a market where prices hadn't inexplicably plummeted due to a sudden glut or a change in local tastes, then, just then, Theophilos might turn a profit. But this profit wasn't for buying racehorses or commissioning statues of himself. It was first and foremost to pay back Sosigenes and his ilk with their crippling interest. Then it was to repair the now even more battered sea slug for her next ordeal. Then to provision for that voyage, pay off any lingering debts from the previous one, and hopefully, just hopefully, leave a small surplus to feed his family, patch the leaking roof of his modest house in Athens, and perhaps allow his wife to buy a new ribbon for their daughter. A truly successful voyage, one that actually left him feeling slightly ahead, was as rare as a sober sailor on shore leave. More often, it was a desperate scramble to break even, to simply earn enough to try again, to keep the wolves of debt from the door for another season. One major shipwreck, one devastating pirate attack, one catastrophic market collapse, and he could be ruined, his ship seized, his family facing destitution. It was less a business and more a form of high-stakes gambling where the house always had an unfair advantage, and the croupier was a cackling, trident-wielding sea god. And herein lay the grand, soul-crushing irony that gnawed at Theophilos during those long, dark nights at sea, accompanied only by the creaking of the sea slug and the distant, mocking laughter of the Nereids. He, and thousands like him, were the unsung, unglamorous lifeblood of the entire Hellenistic world. The grain they ferried from the fertile plains of Egypt, or the vast steppes around the Black Sea, was what kept the teeming populations of cities like Athens, Corinth, and Rhodes from descending into famine. The wine they shipped from the sun-drenched islands of the Aegean, the olive oil that was a staple of Greek life for cooking, lighting, and hygiene, the timber from Macedon that built the houses and ships, the metals from Laurian or Cyprus that were forged into tools and weapons, the fine pottery that graced the tables of the wealthy, even the exotic papyrus from Egypt that allowed philosophers to write their treatises and bureaucrats to levy their taxes. All of it moved on the backs of creaking, overloaded merchant ships captained by men like Theophilos. They were the arteries and veins of a vast interconnected economic body, facilitating not just the movement of goods, but the spread of ideas, culture, and language. Yet, what was their societal standing? Their reward for this pivotal, foundational role? For the common sailor, it was a life of brutal hardship, appalling conditions, and a social status somewhere between a stray dog and a particularly unpopular tax collector. Their immense physical labor, their hard-won seamanship, their quiet courage in the face of daily peril. All this was taken for granted, dismissed as the lot of the lower orders. For Theophilos, the merchant captain, even if he managed to avoid utter ruin and achieve a modest level of prosperity, his status was often ambiguous. The landed aristocracy, whose wealth came from the passive ownership of olive groves and vineyards, often looked down upon the grubby, hands-on business of trade as something vulgar and beneath a true gentleman's dignity. Philosophers might extol the virtues of the polis, but they rarely sang paeans to the men whose risky voyages supplied the very parchment on which their lofty thoughts were recorded. Theophilos was handling cargoes worth fortunes, goods that could adorn palaces and fill royal treasuries, yet his own grip on financial security was as tenuous as a rotten rope in a gale. He was the man who delivered the feast, but was often left gnawing on the scraps. And as if the inherent caprices of the sea, the market, and his own damnable ship weren't enough, Theophilos's precarious livelihood was constantly buffeted by vast, impersonal forces utterly beyond his control. A drought in Sicily or a flood in the Nile Delta could decimate harvests, sending grain prices soaring. This might present a fleeting opportunity for immense profit if he happened to have a cargo of grain and could reach the starving market before his competitors. A high-risk, high-reward gamble that often involved sailing through pirate-infested waters or dealing with desperate, rioting populations. More often, though, such events just meant widespread disruption and hardship, a war between two of Alexander's squabbling successors, a depressingly common occurrence, could turn previously safe shipping lanes into deadly gauntlets, with naval patrols from both sides liable to seize neutral ships on suspicion or simply to requisition their cargo and crew for the war effort. Ports could be blockaded, markets closed, and entire regions plunged into chaos, leaving merchants like Theophilos stranded with unsellable goods or unable to procure the cargoes they'd already contracted for. The whims of rulers were another constant source of anxiety. A king needing funds for a new temple, a dowry for his daughter, or simply another lavish banquet, might suddenly impose a new tax on shipping, a special levy on imported luxuries, or demand voluntary contributions from the merchant community with all the subtlety of a cyclops asking for a light snack. A virulent plague sweeping through a region could turn bustling cities into ghost towns, leaving merchants with cargoes of unwanted goods and no one to sell them to. Or worse, no healthy crew to even attempt a voyage. The fear of contagion would halt commerce more effectively than any blockade. Ships like the Sea Slug might be quarantined for weeks, their crews and cargoes rotting in enforced isolation, or simply avoided altogether, their captains watching helplessly as their investments decayed and their own meager resources dwindled. Theophilos would hear whispers in port, tales of cities decimated, of trade routes closed, of fellow merchants who had sailed into a plague-stricken area never to return. Each such story was another cold stone added to the already crushing weight of anxiety he carried. Another reminder that his fate was tied not just to the caprices of the sea and the market, but to the invisible, indiscriminate, and utterly terrifying whims of unseen pestilence. It was a world where ruin could arrive not just on the howling winds of a storm, but on the silent breath of a fever. If there was one defining characteristic of Theophilos's existence as a merchant captain of the Sea Slug, it was its soul-crushing, mind-numbing, back-breaking repetitiveness. This wasn't a life of linear progression towards a comfortable elysium of retirement. It was a monstrous churning cycle, a Sisyphean ordeal where the boulder was a leaky ship laden with debt, and the hill was an eternally stormy sea. The concept of finishing anything was a cruel illusion, a fleeting mirage in a vast desert of ongoing obligations and ever-impending disasters. The to-do list for our weary merchant was etched not on papyrus, but onto his very soul, its ink a mixture of salt water and existential dread. It read something like this: 1. Secure ruinous loan. 2. Acquire questionable cargo. 3. Provision ship with food condemned by weevils. 4. Bribe port officials until eyeballs bleed. 5. Sail into tempestuous pirate-infested waters. 6. Miraculously, or not, survive. 7. Arrive at port, discover cargo damaged, market collapsed. 8. Haggle with sociopathic buyers. 9. Pay off sum of ruinous loan, incurring new, even more ruinous loan. 10. Return to step 2, ad infinitum, until death, dismemberment, or debtor's prison intervenes. There was no true sense of completion, no triumphant mission accomplished. The moment the Sea Slug limped into port after a particularly harrowing voyage, say hauling Rhodian wine through a gauntlet of Cilician pirates to Alexandria, and Theophilos had finished the degrading ritual of bribing the harbor master and placating the customs vultures, the clock was already ticking. The cargo had to be unloaded, a process involving more backbreaking labor, more potential for breakage, and more opportunities for dockside thieves to lighten his load. Then, almost before the sweat had dried on his tunic, began the frantic scramble for a return cargo. What was available? Egyptian grain? Fine linen? Perhaps a consignment of papyrus? Or even, if he was feeling particularly reckless, exotic spices transshipped from the distant east. Each option came with its own set of headaches, haggling over prices with shrewd Alexandrian merchants who could smell desperation like sharks smell blood, inspecting the goods for quality, often a futile exercise, arranging for its transport to his ship, and then the whole miserable process of stowing it securely in the Sea Slug's groaning hold. Simultaneously, he'd be trying to effect rudimentary repairs on his vessel, perhaps convincing a lazy shipwright to patch the most offensive leaks, or personally supervising the mending of a sail that now resembled a beggar's quilt. All this, while also attempting to reprovision with more of those delightful barley cakes and that water that tasted faintly of primordial ooze. There was no respite. Arriving in port wasn't an end. It was merely the frantic, anxiety-ridden overture to the next leg of the infernal cycle. The sea itself seemed to mock him, its vastness a constant reminder that his journeys were but tiny, insignificant loops in an ocean of endless toil. And the Sea Slug herself, his unholy partner in this enterprise, was a monument to the concept of never truly fixed. She was in a perpetual state of managed decay, a floating testament to deferred maintenance and desperate improvisation. Patch one weeping seam in her ancient hull, and another would sigh open a few feet away, as if offended by the attention paid to its neighbor. Replace a frayed section of rigging, and a pulley would seize, or a spar would develop an ominous new crack. That stubborn leak near the stern, the one that always seemed to worsen in a following sea, Theophilos had tried everything, stuffing it with pitch-soaked rags, nailing on extra planks, even, in a moment of profound desperation, offering a heartfelt prayer and a rather good lamprey to a local sea nymph. Nothing truly worked. The mast, a gnarled veteran of countless storms, would groan and shudder in a stiff westerly wind, emitting sounds that Theophilos could only interpret as deeply personal insults or impending structural failure. The port steering oar had a nasty habit of working itself loose from its lashings at the most inopportune moments, usually when trying to navigate a narrow harbor entrance in a cross-current. Each fix was merely a temporary truce in an ongoing war against entropy, a brief stay against the inevitable day when the sea slug would finally give up the ghost and drag him and his worldly goods down to the lightless depths. This constant Sisyphean battle just to keep his primary tool from actively trying to kill him added another layer of grinding exhaustion to his already overburdened existence. The very nature of his trade was one of shifting sands, of constant, unnerving flux. The reliable route to Syracuse for grain might suddenly become a pirate hotspot. The market for Attic pottery in Olbia could dry up overnight when a new, cheaper local supplier emerged. A political spat between Rhodes and Byzantium could close vital shipping lanes or impose crippling new tariffs. Theophilos couldn't just learn one trade route, one type of cargo, and rest on his laurels. Not that he possessed any laurels to rest upon. He had to be constantly vigilant, gathering information, often unreliable whispers in dockside taverns, adapting to new realities, learning new markets, sourcing new goods, and navigating new, equally problematic, sets of local customs and corrupt officials. Just when he thought he'd mastered the intricacies of the Pontic grain trade, a famine in Caria would make shipping figs there a more pressing and perilous venture. This endless need to reinvent himself, to relearn his trade in the face of ever-changing circumstances, ensured that there was truly no end in sight, no comfortable plateau of expertise, just a relentless, ongoing struggle to stay relevant, solvent, and alive. Each supposed success offered no guarantee for the future. It merely bought him a ticket to the next round of the same brutal game. This relentless cycle was made even more inescapable by the tyranny of the sailing seasons. For roughly 4 to 5 months of the year, from late autumn to early spring, the Mediterranean became the mare clausum, the closed sea, a period when furious storms, bone-chilling cold, and unpredictable gales made maritime travel an act of suicidal lunacy. Did this mean Theophilos got a well-deserved holiday, a chance to put his feet up, sip warm wine by the fire, and perhaps even read a scroll or two? The idea was so absurd, it would have made him laugh, if he hadn't forgotten how. The mare clausum was not a period of rest. It was a different, more land-based circle of hell. It was the season of reckoning. Creditors like Sosagines, whose loans were often timed to mature at the end of the sailing season, would come knocking, their polite inquiries about repayment masking an iron will to extract their pound of flesh, or amphora of wine. Theophilos would spend these months desperately trying to beg, borrow, or metaphorically, steal enough to satisfy them, often by taking out new, even more extortionate loans to cover the old ones, sinking ever deeper into the quicksand of debt. It was also the time for major, often ruinously expensive, repairs to the sea slug, trying to undo some of the previous season's accumulated damage and somehow prepare her for the next onslaught. He might even have to resort to taking on short-term backbreaking labor in the Piraeus, hauling cargo for other, more fortunate merchants, or mending nets for fishermen, just to keep food on his family's table. The gnawing anxiety of having no income, coupled with the mounting pressure of debts and the impending need to finance the next season's ventures, made the winter months almost more stressful than facing a storm at sea. At least at sea, his fate was in the hands of the gods and his own seamanship. On land, it was in the clutches of men whose hearts were often colder than the winter wind. He was trapped, a fly in Poseidon's sticky, brine-encrusted web. His entire meager capital, his very identity, was tied up in the rotting timbers of the sea slug. What else could he do? Become a farmer? That required land. something his family had lost generations ago, and skills he didn't possess. He knew the sea, its moods, its dangers, its faint, treacherous promises. He knew how to navigate by the stars, mostly, how to haggle for cargo, how to coax a few more knots out of a reluctant ship. To abandon this life, however wretched, would be to admit defeat, to become nothing. Sometimes, watching a farmer patiently tilling his field near a coastal town, Theophilos would feel a pang of something akin to envy for the solidity of the man's existence, the predictability of the seasons on land. But then he'd remember the droughts, the blights, the taxes, and realize that land-based misery was probably just as profound, merely drier. There was no escape, only the relentless turning of the wheel, the endless cycle of hope and despair, of effort and exhaustion that defined his world. Yet, and here is the strange, stubborn miracle of the human spirit, or perhaps just its infinite capacity for self-delusion, even in this abyss of relentless suffering, tiny fleeting glimmers of something that wasn't entirely awful could occasionally, improbably, manifest. These weren't moments of joy, as a philosopher might define it, nor were they happiness in any recognizable sense. They were more like brief, sharp intakes of breath after being held underwater for too long. Tiny, defiant sparks of grim satisfaction in a universe seemingly designed to extinguish all light. These were the moments that, perhaps, kept Theophilos from simply walking into the sea and not stopping. Imagine the sea slug caught in a monstrous tempest off the coast of Crete. For 2 days and nights, the world is a roaring, churning chaos of black water and screaming wind. The mast groans like a dying giant. Waves crash over the deck, sweeping away anything not tied down. The rain lashes down with blinding fury. Theophilos, soaked to the bone, muscles screaming, voice raw from shouting orders over the din, clings to the tiller, fighting to keep his ship from broaching, from being swallowed whole. He makes impossible calculations, times the waves, uses every scrap of his hard-won knowledge and instinct. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the storm begins to abate. The wind drops its manic shriek to a resentful howl. The waves lessen their assault. Dawn breaks on a gray, battered sea, and the sea slug, though leaking like a sieve and missing half her sail, is still afloat. His crew, bruised, exhausted, and terrified, are alive. In that moment, looking out over the wreckage of his vessel and the sullen, retreating storm, Theophilos would feel not joy, but a profound, bone-deep, almost savage satisfaction. He had faced the worst the sea could throw at him, and he had survived. He had wrestled with Poseidon, and for now, not lost. That was something. That was the grim, unsmiling pride of the survivor, the badassery of sheer endurance. Or picture him in the marketplace of Naucratis, surrounded by a gaggle of shrewd Egyptian grain merchants, their faces impassive, their arguments relentless. They pick apart his cargo, decry its quality, lament the poor market. Theophilos, though inwardly quaking at the thought of returning to Athens with an empty hold and even emptier pockets, stands his ground. He counters their arguments with carefully chosen words, feigns indifference to their lowball offers, perhaps even threatens to sail on to another port, a bluff, but a desperate one. Hours pass in a haze of dust, flies, and increasingly heated negotiation, and then finally, a breakthrough. He secures a price, not magnificent, but better than he dared hope, enough to cover his costs and maybe, just maybe, leave a sliver of profit. As the contracts are sealed, with more grumbling and a final attempt by the merchants to shave off a few more obols, Theophilos would feel a jolt of grim triumph. He had outmaneuvered them, beaten them at their own game. It wasn't the glory of a general, but it was a victory nonetheless, a testament to his cunning and resilience in the cutthroat arena of commerce. The simple act of making landfall after a long and perilous voyage could bring its own unique brand of relief. The first sight of a familiar coastline, the distant smudge of smoke from a settlement, the smell of land, damp earth, pine trees, wood smoke. After weeks of nothing but the sterile tang of salt and sea. As the sea slug finally dropped anchor in the relative calm of a harbor, the cessation of the constant violent motion, the feeling of unmoving earth beneath his feet, even if it was just the dock, would induce a wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost blissful. This wasn't elation. It was the profound, weary gratitude of a man who had been granted a temporary reprieve from a death sentence. Even amidst the grime and misery of the ship, fleeting moments of connection could occur. A particularly black joke shared with his grizzled first mate, one-eyed Theron, after a near capsize, resulting in a shared, harsh bark of laughter that acknowledged their mutual terror and survival. A rare evening when the sea was calm, the stars brilliant, and someone produced a small, smuggled wineskin of surprisingly decent Thasian wine, leading to a few moments of gruff, shared reminiscence or boastful lies before the anxieties of the morrow reasserted themselves. These weren't deep friendships, perhaps, but they were human threads, however frayed, in the vast tapestry of their shared ordeal. Sometimes it was a small, unexpected boon, a day when the wind blew steadily and fairly from the stern, pushing the sea slug along at a surprising clip, shortening the voyage by a precious day or two. The sighting of a pod of dolphins playing in the bow wave, traditionally a good omen, lifting spirits for a few brief moments. A meal where the weevils in the barley cakes were noticeably fewer than usual. These were not life-altering events, but in a life so characterized by relentless negativity, these tiny deviations from the norm, these fleeting fleas of joy in a thoroughly mange-ridden existence, were enough to provide a momentary counterweight to the despair, a flicker of light in the oppressive darkness. They were the things that allowed Theophilos to take a deep breath, square his aching shoulders, and face the next inevitable wave of suck. No matter how tenaciously Theophilos clung to the tiller of the sea slug, defying storms, pirates, and the siren call of utter financial ruin, there was one adversary he could not outmaneuver, one debt he could not defer: time itself. The relentless Aegean sun that had baked his skin and the biting winter winds that had chilled his bones also marked the slow, inexorable passage of years. His body, once a surprisingly resilient instrument of his will, began to betray him in 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle ways. And as his own strength waned, the grim question of succession, of who would inherit this legacy of leaking hulls and looming debts, became ever more pressing. For a man like Theophilos, with a son, young Cleon, the answer was as predictable as it was heartbreaking. The torch, or more accurately, the heavy, sodden, perpetually stinking albatross of the family business, had to be passed. Theophilos hadn't chosen this life of maritime servitude. It had been thrust upon him by circumstance and lineage. And now, with a bitterness that tasted more acrid than the cheapest shipboard wine, he found himself perpetuating the cycle with his own flesh and blood. Young Cleon, a boy who perhaps once dreamed of being a philosopher, a sculptor, or even just a moderately successful goat herder, anything but a sailor, was gradually, inexorably, groomed for the family curse. His apprenticeship began not with gentle instruction, but with the same brutal immersion Theophilos himself had endured. At an age when other Athenian boys might be learning their Homer, Cleon was learning the difference between a reef knot and a bowline by the sting of a rope's end if he fumbled. His small hands, better suited for playing with knucklebones, were soon raw from hauling on wet, abrasive lines and scrubbing barnacles that clung with the tenacity of death. He learned to coil ropes under his father's impatient gaze, each poorly made coil earning him a cuff or a tirade about the importance of order on a vessel where chaos meant death. "A tangled line can snag a man overboard, you witless pup," Theophilos would roar, his voice hoarse not just from shouting but from a deep, unacknowledged well of despair. Do you want to feed the sharks your shipmates because you're too lazy to lay a rope properly? Theophilos watched his son's youth curdle into a premature, weary competence, and a complex, toxic brew of emotions churned within him. There was, admittedly, a sliver of grim pride when Cleon, after nearly drowning for the third time after falling from the rigging, finally learned to climb like a terrified monkey. Good, Theophilos might grunt, his highest form of praise. Perhaps you won't entirely disgrace the family name by becoming fish food before your beard grows. But this pride was always tainted with a profound, suffocating guilt. He saw the fear in Cleon's eyes when the sea slug heeled over in a squall, the same fear he himself had felt, and still felt, though he'd learned to mask it with a veneer of gruff authority. He saw the boy's shoulders beginning to stoop under the weight of premature responsibility, his hands becoming calloused, his laughter, once frequent and carefree, becoming as rare as a calm day in the Cyclades. He was, Theophilos knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, shackling his son to the same leaking, miserable barge of a life he had endured. He was bequeathing him not a thriving enterprise, but a legacy of aching backs, gnawing anxieties, and the ever-present stench of bilge water and potential bankruptcy. Sometimes, late at night, when Cleon was asleep on deck, a small, huddled figure looking far too young for such a harsh world, Theophilos would stare at him, and the urge to weep, or to steer the sea slug onto the nearest rocks and end it all, would be almost overwhelming. But then dawn would break, cold and gray, and the demands of the voyage, the leaking hull, the shifting cargo, the ever-present hunger, would reassert themselves, and the moment of agonizing introspection would pass, buried under another layer of weary resignation. For Cleon, the sea was not a grand adventure. It was a terrifying, inescapable prison. He saw his father, a man who seemed as old and weathered as the ship itself, perpetually stressed, often angry, his face a roadmap of worry. He heard the hushed, fearful tales of other merchants' sons who had sailed off with their fathers and never returned. His dreams, if he dared to have any, were probably of dry land, of a life where the ground didn't constantly heave beneath his feet, and where the loudest sound wasn't the shriek of the wind or the groan of tortured timbers. His relationship with Theophilos was a complex knot of fear, a desperate desire for a scrap of approval that rarely came, and a growing, resentful understanding of the bleak future that stretched before him. He learned not through patient pedagogy, but through harsh experience. A misjudged current that nearly swept them onto a reef would earn him a week of silent, contemptuous glares from his father and the most odious chores, forgetting to secure a vital piece of equipment before a storm might result in a public dressing down that left him burning with shame and a renewed determination to simply become invisible. Theophilos's lessons were often brutal and laced with a dark fatalism. "See that storm gathering, boy?" he might say, pointing a gnarled finger at a bruised horizon. "That's Poseidon reminding you that you're nothing. A flea on the back of a very large, very angry dog. Remember that, and you might live a little longer." There were few alternatives. What else could the son of a struggling merchant do? The family's meager resources, their reputation, such as it was, their entire existence was tied to the sea. Cleon was a link in a chain, and the chain was dragging him down into the same dark waters that had claimed so many before him. And as Cleon was being forcibly molded into the next generation of maritime sufferer, Theophilos himself was engaged in a losing battle against his own decaying body. The Aegean, that cruel and patient creditor, was finally, emphatically, calling in its debts. The chronic cough that had been his companion for decades, once dismissed as just a bit of sea air, now racked his chest with bone-jarring spasms, each cough bringing up a foul taste and leaving him breathless and trembling. The arthritis in his hands, once a dull ache, now felt like shards of hot glass grinding in his knuckles, making the simple act of gripping a tiller an exercise in excruciating willpower. He'd find himself fumbling with knots he could once tie in his sleep, his fingers stiff and unresponsive. His eyesight, once sharp enough to spot a distant dolphin or the subtle change in watercolor that signaled a reef, was dimming. Coastlines that were once familiar now appeared hazy and indistinct, forcing him to rely more and more on Cleon's younger, sharper eyes, a humiliation that stung more than any saltwater spray. His memory, that vital repository of nautical knowledge, market prices, and the faces of treacherous officials, began to fray at the edges. He'd forget names, confuse currents, and sometimes, terrifyingly, find himself momentarily unsure of their position, a lapse that could prove fatal. The slow, agonizing realization of his own obsolescence was perhaps the cruelest torment of all. He'd see the pity, quickly masked but unmistakable, in the eyes of his crew when he struggled to climb the rope ladder, or when his voice cracked with fatigue while shouting orders. He'd notice Cleon, now a young man with muscles hardened by years of labor, taking the initiative in emergencies, his movements quick and decisive, while his own were slow and hesitant. Perhaps a financier in Athens, after a particularly unprofitable voyage where Theophilos had made a costly navigational error due to his failing vision, would send a tactfully worded letter suggesting that young Cleon shows great promise, and perhaps it is time for him to assume a more prominent role in the command of the Sea Slug. Each such incident was another nail in the coffin of his pride, another confirmation of his dwindling utility. He, Theophilos, who had wrestled with storms and outwitted pirates, who knew every treacherous current and hidden cove from Byzantium to Massalia, was becoming a liability, a passenger on his own ship. There was no concept of a dignified retirement for a Greek merchant who hadn't struck it rich. No pension plan, no state-sponsored elder care, no seaside villa where he could peacefully watch the waves, content in the knowledge of a life well lived, or at least, survived. If, by some miracle of shrewd trading, extreme luck, and divine oversight, Theophilos had managed to accumulate a small hoard, he might have been able to buy a tiny plot of land, a few olive trees, and live out his remaining years in relative obscurity, his days punctuated by the phantom rocking of the ship and the taste of salt that never quite left his mouth. But this was the dream of the fortunate few. More likely if Cleon had a shred of filial piety, and if the business hadn't completely collapsed, Theophilos might be relegated to some minor, face-saving tasks ashore. He could sit on the docks, ostensibly guarding cargo, a job even a half-blind, arthritic old man could do mostly, mending nets with trembling, clumsy fingers, or offering unsolicited and increasingly rambling advice to younger sailors who would listen with feigned respect while secretly rolling their eyes. He would become a fixture of the Piraeus, another weathered, forgotten relic of the sea, his stories of epic voyages and daring escapes growing more embellished and less credible with each retelling in the smoky confines of dockside taverns, fueled by cheap wine bought with the few obols Cleon might spare him. He'd watch Cleon sail off on the Sea Slug, his heart a cold knot of fear and a strange, bitter pride, knowing the boy was now facing the same demons he had battled for so long. But if the family fortunes had truly hit rock bottom, if Cleon had been lost at sea, or if his son, hardened by years of his father's harshness, simply couldn't or wouldn't support the old man, Theophilos's prospects were grim indeed. He might end his days as a beggar in the agora, his pleas for a crust of bread lost in the vibrant din of a commerce that had chewed him up and spat him out. Or he could fade into anonymity in some squalid rented room in the poorest part of the city, succumbing to disease and neglect, another piece of human detritus washed up on the unforgiving shores of ancient society. The sea, his lifelong adversary and reluctant provider, the mistress who had demanded everything from him, his youth, his health, his peace of mind, would finally claim its ultimate victory, not by drowning him in its depths, but by rendering him irrelevant, a broken tool cast aside, his decades of struggle and suffering ultimately amounting to little more than a forgotten ripple on its vast, indifferent surface. His final voyage would be into an oblivion even deeper and darker than the unlit abyss of the wine-dark sea on a moonless, starless night. So, Theophilos, our captain of the eternally distressed sea slug, fades from the historical stage, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated abuses of a life spent wrestling the wine-dark and often vile-green Aegean. His name, if it was ever more than a scrawl on a forgotten customs docket or a muttered curse from a creditor, certainly isn't chiseled into the gleaming Pentelic marble of the Parthenon. No odes by Callimachus or Theocritus sing of his legendary skill in navigating by the faint glimmer of dung beetles, a particularly desperate, if apocryphal, navigational technique whispered about in the darkest corners of dockside taverns. No statues by Lysippos capture his likeness, perpetually squinting against sun and spray, his hand permanently gnarled around a phantom tiller. He remains, like the vast majority of humanity from his era, a ghost in the grand, sweeping narrative of Hellenistic civilization, an anonymous footnote in a story that prefers to remember its kings, its philosophers, and its poets, rather than the calloused, salt-encrusted hands that fed them. Consider the marvels of his age, the Pharos of Alexandria, that colossal beacon guiding ships into the busiest port in the world, the Library of Alexandria, a repository of knowledge that sought to contain the wisdom of all mankind, the intricate mathematics of Euclid, the ingenious war machines of Archimedes, the subtle philosophies of Epicurus and Zeno that sought to define the good life. These are the glittering achievements that adorn the annals of history, the proof of Hellenistic genius. Yet beneath the gleaming limestone of the Pharos, beneath the papyrus scrolls that filled the library's shelves, beneath the very olive oil that fueled the lamps by which scholars read and debated late into the night, lies the unseen, unacknowledged foundation of relentless, grueling, and profoundly dangerous labor performed by men like Theophilos. He wore no laurel wreath. His pronouncements were more likely to be about the current price of Egyptian wheat than the nature of the cosmos, and his greatest invention was probably a new and particularly colorful curse to hurl at a snapped oar. Yet without his willingness to brave the tempestuous seas, without the sea slug and its 1,000 creaking, groaning counterparts, the flow of resources that sustained these grand endeavors would have dwindled Mandai. The grain from Egypt that fed the artisans and thinkers of Athens and Alexandria, the timber from Macedon and Asia Minor that built the great cities and their fleets, the metals from Cyprus and Iberia that were forged into tools and weapons, the wine from Rhodes and Chios that lubricated social discourse and religious ritual, even the papyrus itself. All of it moved in the holds of ships captained by these unsung heroes of commerce. They were the ants beneath the obelisk, the countless, anonymous laborers whose collective sweat and toil formed the invisible mortar holding together the magnificent, celebrated edifice of their civilization. His suffering was immediate, visceral, the sting of salt in open wounds, the gnawing hunger, the damp chill that seeped into his bones, the constant thrum of fear, yet his recognition is as intangible as sea foam, as fleeting as his ship's wake. No statues were raised in his honor, no city squares renamed in his memory. His name, whether it was Theophilos, Sosigenes, Demetrios, or any one of 1,000 others, has long since dissolved into the dust of forgotten ports, or the silt of the seabed, indistinguishable from the sand and the shattered amphorae that mark the graves of countless lost voyages. Yet his legacy, and that of his innumerable anonymous colleagues, is everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the world they helped create, hidden in plain sight for those who know where to look. It's in the linguistic tapestry of Koine Greek, the common tongue that spread across the eastern Mediterranean, not primarily through conquest, but through the everyday haggling and cursing of merchants and sailors in countless harbors. It's in the Hellenistic art styles found in distant Bactria, carried along with trade goods on those perilous overland and maritime routes. It's in the imported Egyptian Isis cults that found fertile ground in Greek port cities, a spiritual exchange facilitated by the same vessels that carried grain and linen. It's in the very existence of thriving cosmopolitan centers like Alexandria, Rhodes, or Antioch, cities that lived and breathed through the rhythm of arriving and departing merchant ships. Theophilos didn't just witness history from the uncomfortable, often terrifying vantage point of his ship's deck. He physically moved it, one precarious, frequently unprofitable cargo at a time. He and his kind were the anonymous current, the ceaseless vital pulse of the Hellenistic world, the motive force that allowed its disparate parts to connect, to exchange, to influence one another, and ultimately, to flourish, however briefly, however imperfectly. They were the circulatory system for an empire not just of land, but of ideas, goods, and cultural ferment. So the next time you marvel at the enduring wonders of that ancient world, when you contemplate the philosophical insights that still resonate, the artistic beauty that still inspires, or the sheer audacity of their intellectual and imperial ambitions, spare a thought for the forgotten figures like Theophilos. He sought no glory beyond, perhaps, the dream of one day being out of debt and owning a ship that didn't actively try to drown him on a bi-weekly basis. He received little recompense beyond the meager profits that were so often consumed by interest payments, repairs, and the endless need to propitiate rapacious officials and indifferent gods. Yet, in his unceasing, often brutal labor, in his stubborn, almost pig-headed endurance against odds that would make a modern risk assessor weep, he was far more than just a long-suffering victim of a harsh era. He was a fundamental, indispensable part of the great, unseen engine that powered a civilization. He and his brethren, in their relentless pursuit of commerce, driven by need, by hope, by the lack of any viable alternative, were the gritty, unacknowledged agents of historical process. They weren't just drops in the wine-dark sea. They were its very will to connect, to sustain, to build, one exhausting, terrifying, bilge-pumping voyage at a time. His name is lost, consigned to the eternal silence of forgotten ledgers and watery graves. But his collective contribution, the vast, intricate web of maritime trade that bound together a world, that fed its peoples, fueled its economies, and facilitated the exchange of its cultures, is an eternal thread woven into the very DNA of all subsequent Western, and indeed world, civilization. And that, in the grand, pitiless ledger of history, is a legacy more substantial and enduring than any mountain of bronze or stone, even if Theophilos himself would have probably traded it all for a single voyage where the food was edible, the ship didn't leak, and he actually made enough profit to buy a new pair of sandals without going into further debt.